Hello friends, tonight's story isn't about heroes or healing. It's about what came before all that, before antibiotics, before anesthesia, before hygiene was understood or pain was believed. It's a story of doctors who meant well and patients who suffered in silence. A story of dark glass bottles and iron instruments, of leeches and blistering plasters, of bleeding because they thought it might help. In the soft glow of gaslight, under ceilings blackened with soot, medicine wore a very different face. And the hands that reached to heal often hurt more than they helped. So before you drift off, turn down the lights. Let the noise of the modern world fall away. And come with me, back to a time when illness was mysterious and treatment was guesswork. A time when women were labeled hysterical, when children were dosed with opium, and when even the kindest doctor might do things you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. This is not horror, this is history. And tonight, we're opening the door to the Victorian sick room. Breathe deep, because the air in here is thick, with vinegar, steam, and old, very old fear. Imagine entering a Victorian doctor's office. It smells of musty fabric, camphor, and old sweat. There's a thick rug on the floor, worn thin in places where heavy boots have stood. A case of glass bottles lines the wall, each labelled in careful, faded script. Laudanum, mercurius, syrup of poppy. The doctor greets you with a smile. He offers no soap for your hands, no thermometer, no stethoscope. Instead, he asks to see your urine. He holds it up to the light, swirls it, smells it, even tastes it, if he's traditional. Then he makes a note. Cloudy, yellowish, possible congestion of the spleen. This was not malpractice. It was the standard of care. Because in the 19th century, diagnosis was an art, not a science. Doctors relied on theories that dated back to Hippocrates. Chief among them, the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Your health was believed to be a matter of balance. A rash, too much blood, a chill, excess phlegm, a mood swing, black bile rising in the brain. And treatment, simple. You drained, purged, bled, or shocked the system back into equilibrium. Victorian medicine wasn't about curing a cause. It was about forcing the body to react, often violently, until it seemed better. Consider the mercury pill. It was given for constipation. Just one small silver tablet to stimulate the bowels. But mercury is a poison. It caused vomiting, tooth loss, tremors, hallucinations. Long-term use led to madness, what they called mercurial erethism. The patient might stop speaking, grow paranoid, shake constantly. Still, the pill was praised. It had cleared the system. Children were given it. Elderly patients too. Because to the Victorian mind, a good medicine was one that did something. Pain, vomiting, sweating, all good signs. The illness was being drawn out, even when it was being replaced by something worse. You've been prescribed a blister. It sounds harmless, almost quaint. But in the Victorian world, a blister was a medical treatment, one of the most trusted in a doctor's toolkit. It involved applying a hot, often caustic substance to the skin until it burned, until the flesh beneath rose in bubbles, until the pain became unbearable. Why? Because pain was proof that the body was reacting, that the sickness, whatever it was being drawn out. Blisters were used for everything: headaches, fevers, back pain, depression. A strip of mustard paste, a sheet of leather soaked in ammonia, or a compound of Spanish fly. Yes, the same one used as an aphrodisiac, that seared the skin and left raw patches for days. It wasn't considered cruel. It was considered effective. The theory was simple. Suffering meant healing. And so, patients were blistered, bled purged, their bodies forced into crisis so that they might reset, as if illness were a switch that could be flipped through agony. Sometimes they were, briefly. A fever broke, a swelling went down, and the doctor was praised. But other times, the cure did more harm than any disease. A young woman with nervous troubles might be confined to a dark room for weeks, not allowed to speak, write, or read. The idea was to calm her mind, but isolation only made her worse. Children with colic were dosed with soothing syrups, mixtures of opium and alcohol, sold freely in apothecaries. They slept soundly. Sometimes they didn't wake up. A boy with a cough might be given antimony, a metal that induced vomiting and diarrhea. A girl with stomach aches might be bled weekly until her hands went cold. And still, the doctors believed, because to them the worst thing wasn't pain, it was inaction. Better to do something, anything, than nothing at all. And if the patient died, well, at least everything had been tried. Imagine a surgery in 1850. There is no anesthesia, no sterile gloves, no clean instruments. The room smells of blood and old smoke. Sawdust is scattered on the floor to soak what's coming. The surgeon wears no mask, just an apron already stained from the morning's work. The patient is held down, literally. 2 or 3 strong men, one at the shoulders, one at the legs, sometimes another at the jaw. A 4th man may stand nearby, gripping a stick for the patient to bite. The doctor nods and begins. Speed is everything. A skilled surgeon might remove a limb in under 2 minutes. That's not bragging, that's survival. Every extra second increases the risk of bleeding out. Or worse, the patient waking fully to what's being done. They are awake, conscious, screaming sometimes, moaning, biting through their own tongues. This is not horror fiction. This is a documented fact of Victorian medicine. Before chloroform, before ether, the only tool against pain was speed. And perhaps, if the doctor was merciful, laudanum or brandy beforehand. Some patients were strapped down, others simply fainted. A few, remarkably, remained silent, either from shock or because they believed deep down that this was the price of living. Spectators often watched, medical students, young doctors, occasionally even curious townsfolk. Surgery was a spectacle, bloody, brutal, and public. And once the limb was removed, the stump was cauterized with a red-hot iron, or sewn shut with catgut thread and bare hands. Infection was common. Very few wounds healed cleanly. But if you survived the table, you were considered lucky. You had seen the knife and lived. Of course, not every surgery was so dramatic. Some were internal, performed blind with no imaging, no understanding of bacteria, no certainty of anatomy. Others involved simple abscesses, which doctors would lance again and again, unaware they were spreading infection each time. Still, surgery was seen as hope. Hope wrapped in pain, hope paid for in screams, and those who walked out of the theatre rarely forgot it. They bore their scars not just on the body, but deep beneath the skin. For all its horrors, Victorian medicine was not born of cruelty. It was born of trust. People turned to doctors because they had nowhere else to go. A mother, clutching a feverish child, begged for any remedy. A factory worker, coughing blood into his sleeve, prayed that something, anything, would stop it. A woman, exhausted, confused, crushed by invisible weight, submitted to rest cures, electric baths, bloodletting, not because they wanted pain, but because they believed it was the only way out of it. The doctor's word was law. His office, no matter how grim, was sacred. He carried a black bag, filled with smells and powders and promises. And even when those promises hurt, when they blistered or bled or maimed, most patients did not resist. They submitted. Sometimes out of faith, sometimes out of fear. The hospitals were no better. Overcrowded, underventilated, and echoing with groans, they offered more despair than healing. Sheets were rarely clean. Instruments were used again and again, wiped but not washed. Wounds festered. Patients died row by row, their beds separated only by thin curtains or the width of a breath. And still, people came, because to be ill was to be helpless, and to be helpless was to place your body in someone else's hands. Those hands weren't always gentle, but they were all that stood between you and the dark. Not every doctor was blind to the pain he caused. Some wrote letters late in life confessing doubts. Others changed their methods quietly. A few began to notice patterns, that patients lived longer when left alone than when treated. But medicine, like the body, does not change easily. And for decades, even centuries, pain remained the proof of care. It took brave doctors, and even braver patients, to begin saying no. But in the Victorian world, pain was still the rule, and to question it, that was the beginning of something new. Let's begin with a pill. Small, white, tasteless. A Victorian woman takes it after dinner. She believes it will help with her complexion, make her cheeks rosy, her eyes brighter, her skin smooth and pale. The main ingredient? Arsenic, sold openly, swallowed daily. This wasn't a one-time error. It was a popular, trusted regimen, recommended in women's journals, endorsed by apothecaries, bottled in elegant tins, and marketed under names like Doctor, Rose's complexion tablets, or complexion wafers. Women believed in it because it worked, temporarily. Arsenic dilated the capillaries. It gave the skin a slight flush, masked blemishes, and produced that coveted pallor, the hallmark of delicate femininity. But it also destroyed red blood cells, damaged organs, caused headaches, fatigue, and over time, death. Still, women kept taking it, because beauty in the Victorian world wasn't just skin deep, it was moral, a sign of virtue, of self-control. To be pale was to be pure. To be clear-skinned was to be clean of spirit. So a little poison didn't seem so bad. Men weren't spared. They, too, took arsenic, often in tonics meant to strengthen the nerves or revive the vigor. A man with melancholy might be prescribed a mixture of arsenic and strychnine. Another, struggling with fatigue, given mercury. These weren't desperate folk remedies. These were mainstream medicine. Mercury was the favorite of many physicians. It treated constipation, syphilis, toothaches, liver complaints. It was rubbed into skin, injected, inhaled, swallowed, even applied to the gums as a paste. And the side effects? Drooling, tremors, memory loss, insanity. But those effects were seen not as harm, but as proof the medicine was working. The doctor had done his part. The body, after all, had to suffer before it could be healed. Now imagine yourself in a drawing room in 1875. The gaslight flickers overhead. A thick carpet muffles the sound of footsteps. On the table, a polished wooden box with brass knobs and 2 long cords ending in metal paddles. You are about to undergo electrotherapy, a jolt to the nerves, a spark to the muscles, a cure for nearly anything. This was not fringe science. It was fashionable, respected, recommended by doctors and sold to middle-class families as a miracle. The instructions were simple. Apply the paddles to the temples, the chest, the base of the spine. Turn the knob until you feel a pleasant tingling. That tingling. It was electricity passing through your body, sometimes mild, sometimes not. Electrotherapy was prescribed for everything. Paralysis, anxiety, rheumatism, impotence, fatigue, melancholy. Women were treated for hysteria, men for nervous collapse. Children were occasionally zapped to correct bad behavior. The machines varied in size and power. Some were no larger than a hat box. Others resembled suitcases filled with wires, coils, and metal brushes. A few were designed to look like furniture. An armchair wired to deliver a low current to the seated occupant. Did it work? Sometimes. The current could stimulate circulation, tense weak muscles, or distract from chronic pain, but often the benefits were imagined. The real cure was hope, that this machine, this buzz, this hum, would chase the weakness away. And then there were the magnetic belts, soft leather bands, studded with magnets and worn around the waist, the neck, the thighs. They promised to align the body's energy, improve male vigor, and balance the electrical humors. Victorian men, proud, desperate, quietly anxious, bought them in droves. Some even wore them to bed. It all sounds absurd now, but to them, it was the future. A clean, clinical miracle. No more leeches, no more blood, just a gentle buzz and the promise of control. And that was enough. For a while. If you were a woman in the 19th century, there were many things you could be: wife, mother, daughter, patient. But there was one diagnosis that loomed larger than any other. Hysteria. It was a catch-all, a medical ghost, a word that meant everything and nothing. Too tired? Hysteria. Too loud? Hysteria. Too quiet? Hysteria. Sad after childbirth, anxious before menstruation, refusing your husband's advances, all hysteria. The name came from the Greek word hystera, womb. The idea, ancient and stubborn, was that the uterus could wander, float, drift through the body like a balloon, pressing on organs, twisting emotions, distorting behavior. A wandering womb, a sick woman. So the treatment, restraint, isolation, and stimulation. In more genteel circles, this meant the rest cure. Prescribed famously by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, the rest cure was brutal in its stillness. Women were confined to bed, often for weeks or months, forbidden from reading, writing, talking, walking, fed heavy meals of milk and meat, massaged daily, treated like invalids. The theory was that overstimulation, too much thought, too much feeling, was the cause of illness. Silence and softness would heal. But many women deteriorated. They became anxious, paranoid, listless. They forgot how to speak with ease, how to trust their own thoughts. For others, the cure took a darker turn. Some doctors used forced clitoral stimulation, a practice still debated and often denied, but whispered of in manuals and diaries. The goal was to relieve congestion, to calm nerves, and when that failed, hysterectomies, literal removal of the uterus, to fix not a physical disease, but a spiritual, emotional defect. It was sanctioned, taught, praised, and it left countless women broken, childless, or simply vanished. Some resisted. They wrote diaries, letters, short stories. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper is one such rebellion, a fictional scream against the quiet of the rest cure. But most women didn't write. They lay in beds. They wept in silence, and they were told they were better. Even as they faded, there was one bottle in every Victorian household, small, brown, corked, labelled soothing syrup, or infant's cordial, or elixir of calm. Its contents, opium, sometimes mixed with alcohol, morphine, or chloroform, and it was given to everyone, to babies with colic, to mothers with nerves, to soldiers with wounds that wouldn't close, to clerks with headaches, to widowers with trembling hands. The logic was simple. Pain is suffering. Opium removes pain. Therefore, opium heals. And in a sense, it did. It dulled the ache, slowed the panic, let the lungs relax, the stomach ease, the mind float. Children stopped crying. Women slept through the night. Old men died more peacefully. It was sold in shops, handed out by midwives, recommended in newspapers, and no one questioned it because it worked, at first. But the trouble with opium isn't that it doesn't help. It's that it helps too much. The more you take, the more you need. And the more you need, the less you function without it. Addiction wasn't well understood in the Victorian era. The word itself was rarely used. Instead, people spoke of opium habits, of nervous dependence. And when patients tried to stop, the symptoms were frightening: sweating, trembling, screaming, night terrors. In babies, it was worse. Some went limp and never woke up. There are parish records, dry, factual, cold, listing child deaths attributed to wasting, failure to thrive, or crib death. But behind those phrases, historians now believe, were overdoses. Not from cruelty, from love, from exhaustion, from parents who just wanted the baby to stop crying for a few hours, just long enough to sleep. And the bottle was right there, by the fire, on the shelf, next to the bread. It was called Godfrey's Cordial, or Mother Bailey's Quieting Syrup. It promised peace. And for a little while, it delivered. Mental illness in the Victorian era was not treated. It was contained. And one of the most common treatments, bleeding, for mania, melancholy, hallucinations, delusions. The first step was often to open a vein. Sometimes it was the arm, sometimes behind the ears, sometimes the neck. The goal was to reduce congestion of the brain, to release the excess blood believed to cause madness. And when bleeding didn't work, they tried cupping, a heated glass dome placed on the skin, quickly to form a vacuum, drawing the blood to the surface. Dozens of cups sometimes, lined along the spine, the skull, the chest. Bruises formed. Patients writhed, but they were told it would help. There are records from asylums, handwritten, meticulous, listing patients who were bled weekly, some daily, others until they fainted, and always the same note. Patient was calmer after, not cured, not well, just quieter. Other treatments followed. Cold water baths, long, shivering, eyes open but unseeing. Rotating chairs, where the patient was strapped in and spun rapidly to disorient and reset the mind. And restraints, leather, iron, rope, to prevent escape, but also to reduce stimulation. Some of the doctors believed in kindness. They spoke of sunlight, gardens, reading aloud. But even in the best asylums, fear ruled. Because no one knew what madness really was. Was it sin? A humoral imbalance? A punishment? And if it could not be understood, it had to be silenced. Bleeding was neat, predictable, sanctioned. So it continued, even as the patients thinned, even as they stopped speaking, even as they stopped being seen as people, just bodies, to be managed, to be bled. While women were labelled hysterical, Victorian men were haunted by a different spectre. Weakness, not physical, though that was feared too, but moral, spiritual, sexual. There was a word for it: self-abuse. A polite phrase for masturbation, and it was believed to be deadly. Doctors warned that solitary vice would lead to blindness, madness, spinal weakness, heart failure, even death. It was a one-way path to ruin, a moral collapse that infected the flesh. So how did they treat it? With severity. Young men and boys were placed in straitjackets, tied hands at night, metal cages fitted over the genitals, shocking devices, mild to painful, applied if temptation struck. There were pills, tonics, ointments designed to suppress desire. Some doctors advocated circumcision, not for hygiene, but to reduce sensitivity and curb impure thought. Others went further. In rare, brutal cases, testicles were removed. The thinking was, if the source of temptation was biological, eliminate it. These practices were not widespread, but they were real. Recorded in medical journals, letters, and asylum logs. Even less extreme treatments carried shame. Men were told to avoid rich food, to bathe in cold water, to think of holy things. They were discouraged from sleeping on their backs, forbidden from reading novels, warned against warm beds, soft sheets, or idle hours. Sex, even in marriage, was to be controlled, rationed, discussed with priests and physicians, because the male body was a battlefield, desire was a threat, and the cure was control. Not healing, but discipline. In pamphlets and sermons, the message was clear. A good man resisted, a weak man failed, and those who failed, they were not comforted, they were corrected, with shame, with punishment, with silence. The Victorian era was not only a time of superstition, it was a time of invention. Tinkerers, doctors, quacks, and entrepreneurs flooded the market with devices they claimed could heal almost anything. And people believed them, because they were desperate, because the pain was real, because science, even misunderstood, gave hope. Take the tobacco smoke enema. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. In the 1800s, doctors believed that blowing tobacco smoke into the rectum could revive drowning victims, stimulate respiration, even treat colds or intestinal lethargy. Special kits were sold with bellows, tubes, and canisters of dried tobacco. It sounds absurd now, but at the time, it was endorsed by medical journals, paid for by hospitals, even stocked at riverside rescue stations. Then there were vibrating chairs, some designed for the spine, others for the pelvis. They buzzed and jolted and rocked, sometimes violently. The idea was to stimulate circulation or quicken the womb. Some were marketed toward women, supposedly to cure nervous disorders. Others toward businessmen, to restore vitality lost in long days of clerking and city smog. Doctors promoted them, families bought them, and patients endured them. There were electric collars, magnetic corsets, hairbrushes made with zinc to charge the scalp, shoes lined with copper, hats with tin discs. Teeth braces meant not to straighten, but to realign the soul. And in every home, a medicine cabinet filled with elixirs, snake oil, tincture of radium, cocaine tooth drops, heroin for children's coughs. None of it worked the way they said, but it gave people something, a sense of control, a story to tell, a reason to believe they might feel better tomorrow. And maybe, in an age where real understanding was so far away, that was the most dangerous cure of all. Victorian medicine wasn't just cruel, it was colonial. As the British Empire expanded across continents, its doctors did more than treat their own. They studied, extracted, and rebranded the remedies of others. In India, in Africa, in the Americas, they encountered ancient healing systems, herbal traditions, massage, steam, plant-based medicine, remedies that had worked for generations. And what did they do? They brought back samples, documented recipes, translated sacred knowledge into Western language, often stripping it of context, ceremony, or respect. A bitter bark used by Andean healers became quinine. A North American plant, echinacea, became a cold cure. Ayurvedic and Unani compounds were sold under new names, in new bottles, with new prices. And often, the original healers were pushed aside, labeled as superstitious, primitive, or outright banned from practicing. Because the empire didn't just conquer land, it conquered knowledge. But the irony, many of these foreign cures worked better than what was being offered in British hospitals. Turmeric, long used for inflammation, was shown to reduce swelling. Neem, a traditional antiseptic, was more effective than many European soaps. Chinese medicine had advanced diagnostic techniques centuries ahead of Western pulse-taking. Still, colonial doctors clung to their scalpels and syringes. They didn't want new methods. They wanted new markets. And so the cures were bottled, rebranded, sold in pharmacies, with no mention of where they came from, no credit, no consent, just profit. Victorian medicine painted itself as the height of civilization. But behind the glass bottles and Latin labels was something stolen. And it's only now, more than a century later, that we begin to acknowledge it. Not just the harm done in sick rooms, but the harm done in silence. For all its poisons, punishments, and primitive logic, Victorian medicine wasn't just about harm. It was about belief. People believed in their doctors, in powders and poultices, in the idea that pain could mean progress, and that discomfort was the first step toward healing. They believed because they had to, because the alternative, that there was no cure, no hope, no help, was unbearable. And belief, as it turns out, is powerful. Placebos have always existed, not in deception, but in trust. A mother rubbing balm on her child's chest. A man taking bitter drops each night before sleep. A young woman whispering prayers over a tonic bottle before swallowing it. These rituals mattered. Even when they didn't work physically, they worked emotionally. They gave structure to suffering. They turned chaos into routine. They made illness manageable. And so, Victorian medicine became part science, part theatre, a dance of robes and instruments, smells and sensations, routines that felt sacred even when they weren't. Doctors tapped the knee, checked the tongue, scribbled in Latin. And the patient, cold, afraid, exhausted, felt seen. Even if the diagnosis was wrong, even if the cure did harm, because sometimes being cared for, or the illusion of it, was enough. We look back now with horror, but they looked forward with hope. And maybe that's what history asks of us. Not to excuse the pain, not to glorify the ignorance, but to remember how deeply people needed to believe that someone could help. Imagine being a woman in 1847 Vienna. You're in labor, terrified, exhausted, in pain, and you've been brought to the public hospital because that's where the poor go. It's cleaner than most places. It's where the trained doctors are. That's what everyone says. And then, within hours of giving birth, you begin to shiver. Your skin turns pale, your belly hardens, your breath shortens. By morning you're dead, not from the childbirth, from the doctor. This wasn't rare. It happened over and over. Thousands of women dying from what they call childbed fever. A terrifying, fast-moving infection that spread through maternity wards like fire. No one understood why. Some blamed the air, others the milk, or the mother's own weakness. But one man, Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, saw something else. He noticed that in one division of the hospital, where deliveries were done by doctors and medical students, the death rate was 5 times higher than in the other division, where only midwives worked. He looked closer, and he saw the truth. The doctors were coming directly from autopsies. They'd dissect corpses in the morning, and then, without washing their hands, examine laboring women. The connection was obvious to him, so he tried something simple. He asked them to wash their hands with chlorinated lime between every patient, and almost overnight, the death rate dropped dramatically. He had found the answer. He had saved lives, and for that, he was dismissed. His colleagues mocked him, resented him. His theories were called insulting, unscientific, hysterical. Hand washing was too simple, too dirty a suggestion. No one wanted to believe they were the cause. Semmelweis lost his job. His mind slowly unraveled. He died in an asylum, ignored, broken, uncelebrated. It would take decades before his discovery was recognized. But how many women died? Because no one listened. Because pride mattered more than pain. Because medicine had not yet learned the humility to wash its hands. In 1853, Queen Victoria gave birth to her 8th child. But this birth was different because for the first time, she felt no pain. She was given chloroform, inhaled from a cloth placed gently over her mouth and nose. Within moments, the agony of labor softened. Within minutes, it faded entirely. And when it was over, she awoke to find her child already in her arms. It was called the Blessed Relief. But not everyone blessed it. In fact, many doctors and almost every bishop condemned it. Pain in childbirth, they argued, was divine. A curse pronounced in Genesis. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. To remove that pain was to defy God. And besides, they said, what if the mother died under anesthesia? What if the baby was harmed? What if women began expecting comfort? But Queen Victoria was not swayed. She called the experience delightful. And suddenly, what had been scandalous became fashionable. Upper-class women began requesting chloroform, then middle class. Eventually, even poor women, though they often received it too late, or not at all. The tide had turned. But there was a cost. Because the rush to use anesthesia outpaced the understanding of how it worked. Ether, chloroform. These were powerful, unpredictable drugs. Some patients reacted violently. Others stopped breathing entirely. There were no monitors, no oxygen tanks, no safety nets. Doctors relied on intuition and prayer, and many, eager to impress or appease, gave too much. Chloroform became a cure-all for surgery, for labor, for dental work, for nerves. And sometimes it helped, but other times it killed, quickly, quietly, without warning. The Queen's birth had opened a door, not just to comfort, but to risk. And in the years that followed, medicine would struggle to balance the two. Relief and responsibility, pain and protection. And the lesson that even the best intentions, even the royal ones, can lead to harm if not handled with care. In the early 1800s, before anesthesia, surgery was all about speed. The faster the procedure, the better the outcome. Less pain, less shock, less chance for the patient to thrash or die on the table. And no one was faster than Robert Liston. He was a legend in London's surgical theatres, known as the fastest knife in the West End. A man who could amputate a leg in under 30 seconds. Spectators timed him. Students gasped. Assistants had to be careful not to get in the way. But speed came with risk. Liston's most infamous operation began like many others. A man with a gangrenous leg. The theatre was packed. Liston entered, rolled up his sleeves, and announced, "Time me." The knife flashed. The patient screamed. Blood sprayed. And in his speed, in that drive to beat the clock, Liston made 3 cuts. Not one. He amputated the patient's leg. He also slashed through his assistant's fingers. And, as he swung the blade, he caught the coattails of a spectator. An elderly surgeon who thought he'd been stabbed collapsed in fear and died of a heart attack. The patient died of infection. The assistant died of sepsis. The spectator died on the floor. 3 deaths, 1 surgery. It remains the only recorded operation in history with a 300% mortality rate. Of course, Liston saved many lives too. He was not a butcher. He was a man doing the best he could in a brutal system, with brutal tools and almost no safety measures. But his story is a reminder that even the best, the fastest, the most respected, could make mistakes, terrible ones, not because they didn't care, but because they were working in a world that didn't yet understand how fragile the human body really was, and how easily it could be harmed, even by the hands that meant to save it. Today, hospitals are places of healing, sterile, monitored, safe. But in the 19th century, they were a last resort, a place you went only when there was no other option. And even then, you might have been better off at home. Victorian hospitals, especially in cities, were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and reeking of waste, sweat, and rot. Germ theory was still controversial. Cleanliness was inconsistent. And infection was everywhere. Surgeons reused tools without sterilizing them. Bandages were washed, sometimes, dried on radiators, reused across patients. Wounds were sewn up with unwashed fingers, and wards were packed wall to wall with the sick and dying. One man coughing blood, another groaning in delirium, a third already gone, his bed not yet cold. There was no privacy, no peace. You could be recovering from a broken leg next to someone with smallpox. You could die from the hospital stay itself, not from your injury. The most feared affliction wasn't even a disease. It was hospitalism, a vague term used for the decline patients experienced after being admitted. They became pale, listless, prone to infection. Sometimes they recovered. Often they didn't. And then came Florence Nightingale, She wasn't a doctor. She had no formal medical training. But she saw what others would not. That filth kills. During the Crimean War, she transformed military hospitals. She demanded clean sheets, fresh air, basic hygiene. She tracked survival rates, reduced deaths, and proved that care, not just cure, saves lives. She brought order to chaos, light to darkness, and slowly the system began to shift. Hospitals cleaned up, but it took decades. And for many, the poor, the forgotten, the quietly dying, the change came too late. Because even when the body was strong, the hospital itself could still break it. In the final decades of the 19th century, doctors grew bolder in their experiments. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the treatment of the mentally ill. Some wanted to help, truly, but their methods were cold, literally. One common cure for madness, especially mania or hallucinations, was the cold bath. Not a gentle soak, not a calming ritual, but an immersion in near-freezing water. The patient was stripped, held, lowered into a tub of ice-cold water without warning. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, sometimes until they passed out. And this was not done in silence. Patients screamed, thrashed, begged. Nurses were instructed to hold them down, to keep their heads above water, but nothing more. The goal was not comfort. It was control. And it worked, in a terrible way. A patient emerged quiet, shivering, passive. Doctors called this success, because the shouting had stopped, because the resistance was gone. Some asylums took it further. Cold wraps, sheets soaked in icy water, bound tightly around the body, limbs pinned, chest compressed. The patient left like that for hours, unable to move, barely able to breathe. It was said to cool the brain, to slow the blood, to numb the nerves, to silence the spirit. And in many cases, it did. But not because the illness was gone, because the person had been frightened into silence. Doctors documented the results clinically. Agitation reduced, speech minimal, compliant with care. But what they called compliance was often collapse, a breaking of something unseen. And in the quiet that followed, in the stillness of those post-treatment hours, it was easy to mistake fear for peace, even easier to call it a cure. In the Victorian mind, the uterus was not just an organ, it was a problem. Doctors believed it wandered, misbehaved, caused mood swings, weeping fits, insomnia, indecision. And when rest cures, diets, and moral guidance didn't solve the issue, they turned to surgery. Hysterectomy, the removal of the uterus, became a solution to what were often psychological or social problems. A woman too anxious, too opinionated, too sad for too long. Doctors would sometimes recommend the operation, not to treat a tumor, but to tame her. The logic was chillingly simple. If the womb was the seat of a woman's trouble, then remove it. Problem solved. No regard for fertility. No consideration of consent. Often no clear diagnosis at all. Just discomfort. A woman who did not fit. In some cases, families asked for it. Husbands signed the forms. Women were told it was necessary, a kindness, a mercy. And afterward, they were praised for their calmness, for their quiet, for no longer disturbing the household. But inside, many were broken, not just by the surgery itself, which was dangerous, painful, and frequently fatal due to infection, but by the knowledge that something sacred had been taken, not to save them, but to silence them. It wasn't just hysterectomies. Clitoridectomies were also performed, especially on young girls, to prevent masturbation, to control desire. It was medicine as morality, science twisted into shame. And though the procedures were rare, their shadow was wide. They sent a message that women's bodies were the property of others, to be altered, corrected, cut, not for healing, but for obedience. Dr. Henry Cotton was a rising star in early 20th century psychiatry, just on the edge of the Victorian era's end. He had a theory, a dangerous one. He believed that mental illness wasn't caused by trauma, or environment, or heredity. He believed it was caused by infection, hidden pockets of bacteria in the teeth, the tonsils, the intestines, were, he claimed, the root of all madness. And so he set out to cure it. He began pulling teeth, hundreds of them, from patients who were already vulnerable, already afraid. And when the symptoms didn't improve, he removed tonsils, then gallbladders, then stomachs, then parts of the colon, organs, one after the other, always in search of the infection that caused the madness. His hospital in New Jersey became a place of horror, a clean, white-walled asylum where patients walked in with anxiety and left without half their bodies, or didn't leave at all. His death rate was staggering. But Cotton defended his work. So did his colleagues. His books were published. His results, skewed, self-reported, rarely verified, were praised. For years no one stopped him, because his theory sounded scientific, because he wore the coat and carried the authority and spoke with confidence, and because in medicine it's always easier to cut than to question. Eventually, his methods fell out of favor, not because he was exposed, but because newer theories came along. And just like that, he was forgotten. But the bodies weren't. They were buried, silently, in neat rows, with mouths that could no longer speak, and minds that were never truly listened to. Among the saddest victims of Victorian medicine were the ones least able to speak for themselves. Children. They were small, fragile, often poor, and if they were sick, strange, or simply inconvenient, they were institutionalized, sometimes for epilepsy, sometimes for developmental delays, sometimes just for being difficult, and once inside, they were rarely touched, rarely taught, rarely held. They were examined, catalogued, left in cribs or rows of beds, one nurse for dozens, one doctor making notes from a distance. There are journals from the time, dry and clinical, listing symptoms in children, stares without expression, rocks back and forth, does not respond to commands. Today, we might recognize these as signs of autism, trauma, neglect. Back then, they were considered evidence of idiocy, and idiocy was not to be treated. It was to be managed, sometimes with cold baths, sometimes with silence, sometimes with surgery. There were attempts at education, rudimentary, rote, strict, but many children regressed, not from disease, but from loneliness, from isolation, from a life without comfort. Some were given opium, others strapped to beds, and others simply disappeared, died of infections, malnutrition, despair, their names marked in ledgers, their causes of death softened by euphemism, wasting, nervous collapse, failure to thrive. But the truth, they were forgotten by medicine, by society, by history, until now. because even the smallest voices, the ones silenced before they could speak, deserve to be remembered. We like to think of medicine as a straight line, a steady march from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge, from harm to healing. But history doesn't work like that. It lurches, falters, doubles back, and for every step forward, someone paid the price. In the Victorian age, those people were everywhere. The woman locked in a bedroom until her mind unraveled. The man bled for sadness until he collapsed. The child soothed with opium and never woke again. The patient strapped to a chair that spun until the world stopped making sense. The mother who died not from birth, but from the hands meant to save her. Doctors weren't villains. They were human, trained in faulty systems, armed with half-truths, pressured to act, to fix, to do something, even when the best thing might have been nothing. And sometimes they made it worse, not out of malice, but because the tools they had, theories, tonics, beliefs, were all they knew. We remember the breakthroughs: anesthesia, antisepsis, germ theory. But we must also remember the pain that came before them, because behind every advance is a patient who didn't live to see it, a name scratched in a hospital ledger, a silence left in a home, a lesson carved into the history of healing. Not every Victorian patient was passive. Some, in the face of rigid systems and painful cures, pushed back, not with fists, not with riots, but with silence, with writing, with small, stubborn acts of defiance that whispered, "I am still here." One woman prescribed the rest cure, secretly wrote stories in pencil under her mattress. Her name was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and the story she penned, The Yellow Wallpaper, would one day be recognized as a masterpiece. But at the time, it was just a lifeline, a way to say, "I am not broken, you just do not see me." Another patient, a man in a London asylum, refused to speak for months. Doctors believed he was mute, but years later, when the asylum was inspected by outsiders, he suddenly began to talk, clearly, calmly. His words, "I was waiting for someone who would listen." Even children found their own ways. One girl, subjected to ice baths for overexcitement, learned to feign sleep, to hold her breath, to slow her pulse, to avoid the worst of it. She grew up, became a nurse, changed the rules from within. Others resisted in ways no record kept, by humming to themselves during treatment, by hiding their pills, by gripping the hand of a stranger in the next bed, a silent gesture of survival. They weren't loud, they weren't praised, but they endured, and in doing so, they changed medicine, slowly, softly, by reminding the world that pain is not weakness, that obedience is not health, and that even the smallest voice can carry the weight of something sacred. Dignity. Sometimes resistance didn't look like rebellion. It looked like a woman, closing a door, refusing the next dose, refusing the next bath, refusing to be quiet when told to. In the late 1800s, a woman in Edinburgh was admitted to an asylum for melancholia. She had lost her husband, her job, and her place in the city. They told her she must rest, that she must not speak of her grief, that to cry was weakness, and to protest was hysteria. She didn't scream. She wrote letters to friends, to newspapers, to members of parliament, not about her pain, but about her treatment. She described the food, the cold, the boredom, the way nurses avoided eye contact, the way no one answered her questions. Eventually, someone read them. An inspector came, and though she was never freed, the rules changed. A little. Meals were improved. Windows unbarred. Silences interrupted. Her name was forgotten, but her refusal echoed. Elsewhere, in rural hospitals, patients resisted more simply, by walking out, literally. Some slipped away at dawn, barefoot and quiet. Others walked calmly through the front door, daring the staff to stop them. They were rarely chased, because by then, even the doctors knew. Some patients weren't sick. They were just inconvenient. And when they left, the hospital didn't crumble. The world didn't end. Sometimes they got better, because leaving the treatment was the cure. These acts didn't topple institutions. They didn't rewrite laws, but they mattered. They proved that medicine, no matter how confident, must still listen. And that healing begins sometimes not with surrender, but with a single, quiet number. Resistance isn't always about escape. Sometimes it's about endurance. And endurance is made possible by connection. In the long wards and locked rooms of Victorian hospitals, patients found each other, quietly, secretly, through glances, gestures, or whispered words exchanged when the nurses turned their backs. They formed friendships, unlikely, urgent, and deeply human. Two men placed side by side for weeks began to share meals, then thoughts, then laughter. One taught the other to play chess with scraps of paper. The other taught the first how to pray again, in his own way. No one recorded their names, but they were seen briefly by a visiting chaplain, who described the two men as watchful of each other and better for it. In another ward, women braided each other's hair, not as a game, but as comfort. One patient, dying of tuberculosis, left her scarf to the woman beside her, a gesture of closeness, a final act of being known. These were not acts of rebellion in the traditional sense, but they were a kind of refusal, a refusal to be just a number, just a diagnosis, just a problem to be solved. Even the smallest kindness, a song hummed, a hand held, became resistance, not against medicine itself, but against its coldness. And when those bonds were severed, when one patient was discharged or died, the absence was real. Grief passed between beds like a shadow, but so did memory, a story shared, a name remembered, a kindness paid forward. In these connections, there was a lesson that medicine, even today, still sometimes forgets. That healing is not always about cure. It's about being human together. Most of the people we've met tonight, the patients, the quiet resistors, the ones who whispered rather than shouted, left behind no monuments, no statues and no plaques, no books with their names on the spine, but they changed history, not by overthrowing it, by enduring it. Each time a patient said, "This hurts," they pushed medicine a little closer to compassion. Each time someone wrote down their suffering, in a diary, a letter, a novel, they preserved a truth that might otherwise have been erased. Each time someone reached out across a hospital bed, they reminded us what care really means. Modern medicine is better now, cleaner, kinder, based on science, but the roots remain, and so does the warning. To always listen, to always question, and to never forget those who suffered quietly so that others might suffer less. They did not fight with fire. They fought with presence. They stayed. They spoke softly. And in doing so, they saved us. So now, the lamps are low, the voices have faded, and you are left with the silence that remains after history is told. The kind that hums beneath the skin, not loud, not insistent, just present. We've wandered through a world where doctors bled their patients in good faith, where children were calmed with opium, where women were cured into silence, where pain was often seen not as a problem, but as proof. And yet, through it all, people survived. Not always cured, not always seen, but alive in spite of it. Their strength wasn't loud. It didn't win battles. It didn't write laws. It endured. In bedsheets clutched during surgery. In eyes that stared back during cold baths. In pens scratching softly across the margins of a locked ward's notebook. They were not rebels in the usual sense, but they taught the world something every bit as revolutionary. That the body is not a battleground. That suffering is not noble. That care, real care, begins with listening. And tonight, maybe you listen too. To stories once hidden. To people once forgotten. To truths that were always there, waiting to be heard. Now, rest easy, because somewhere in that long night of history, someone whispered, "No more." And someone else finally answered, "I hear you." Good night, and thank you for listening.